The autumn wind carried dust and dying leaves across the valley, whispering secrets of a land that had witnessed too much blood. 5 years had passed since the massacre at Eagle Valley, but for some, time was merely a concept, not a healer. The sun hung low in the Arizona sky, painting the mountains with shades of crimson that reminded Thomas Reed of things he'd spent half a decade trying to forget. His right hand tightened around the reins as his horse trudged along the narrow trail leading to Silver Creek. The animal sensed his tension, ears flicking backward, then forward again, hooves striking the hard-packed earth with uncertain rhythm. Thomas loosened his grip, inhaling deeply, willing the memories to retreat back into the shadows where he kept them locked away. "Almost there, boy," he murmured, more to steady himself than to comfort the horse. "Just supplies and back to the ranch. No trouble." The words hung empty in the cooling air. Thomas knew better than to make such promises. Trouble had a way of finding him, even when he'd gone to extraordinary lengths to disappear. 5 years ago, he'd been Captain Caleb Thornton of the 4th Cavalry. Now he was just Thomas Reed, a rancher with a small spread outside Silver Creek, a man who kept to himself and avoided questions about the scar that ran from his left temple down to his jawline, or why his left shoulder drooped slightly lower than his right when he was tired. The wound in his shoulder throbbed as the temperature dropped. It always did, a permanent reminder of the day his best friend had put a bullet in him. Lieutenant Theodore Hayes had been aiming for his heart, but missed by inches when Caleb had turned at the last moment, trying to shield a young Apache woman and her child from Hayes' rifle. The same fire that had consumed the Apache village had been reported to have claimed Caleb Thornton's life as well. It was easier that way. Easier to be dead than to live with what he'd witnessed, what he'd failed to stop. The first buildings of Silver Creek appeared in the distance, simple structures of wood and stone that comprised the main street. Thomas pulled his hat lower, a habit formed from years of hiding his face. His beard helped conceal the scar, but caution had become second nature. The town had grown since his last visit 3 months ago. A new saloon stood where an empty lot had been, its fresh paint suggesting prosperity. Silver Creek was changing, expanding with the promise of silver mines in the hills. More people meant more eyes, more chances for recognition. Thomas made a mental note to be even more cautious. He rode past the general store, the smoothie, the small church, and finally reached Jacobson's Feed and Supply. Dismounting with practiced ease despite his aching shoulder, Thomas tied his horse to the hitching post and adjusted his gun belt out of habit. The weight of his Colt revolver was a constant companion, a burden he couldn't bring himself to relinquish despite his desire for peace. The bell above the door jangled as he entered the store, causing Mrs. Jacobson to look up from her ledger. Her weathered face creased into a smile of recognition, one of the few people in town who bothered to be friendly to the reclusive rancher. "Mr. Reed," she greeted him, "was wondering when you'd make your way into town. Winter's coming early this year." Thomas nodded, removing his hat. "That's why I'm here. Need to stock up before the first snow." "Smart man." She closed her ledger. "The usual then? Flour, coffee, beans, ammunition, and some extra blankets if you've got them." While Mrs. Jacobson gathered his supplies, Thomas stood with his back to the wall, observing the few other customers in the store, a habit from his military days, always assessing, always wary. The door jangled again, and Sheriff Liam Garrett entered, his badge catching the lamplight. Thomas stiffened slightly. He'd managed to avoid more than passing interactions with the wall since arriving in Silver Creek. The sheriff was known to be fair, but sharp-eyed, exactly the kind of man Thomas preferred to keep his distance from. Garrett nodded in Thomas's direction, but made no move to approach, engaging instead with another customer. Thomas relaxed marginally, focusing again on Mrs. Jacobson as she returned with his supplies. "That'll be $6.45, she said, tallying the items. Thomas reached into his pocket for the money when a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Raised voices, the sound of horses, and men shouting orders. "What's that about?" Mrs. Jacobson wondered aloud, moving toward the window. Thomas stayed where he was, instinct telling him to remain unnoticed, but curiosity pulled his gaze toward the street. A crowd had gathered near the center of town, where a wooden platform had been erected. He'd seen such structures before, sometimes used for public announcements, other times for more grim purposes. Sheriff Garrett moved to the door, then paused, looking back at the store's occupants. "Folks might want to stay inside. Baldwin's brought in some prisoners. Says they're Apache renegades, but looks to me like just a woman and an old man. He's putting on one of his shows. Thomas felt his blood run cold. Wesley Baldwin was the owner of the largest silver mine in the area and the new saloon in town. Thomas had heard stories about the man's treatment of native workers and his personal vendetta against the Apache after losing some property in a raid years back. Shows? Mrs. Jacobson asked, her voice dropping. You mean he's selling them? The sheriff's mouth tightened. It's not legal, but Baldwin calls them indentured servants captured in conflict. Says he's doing a service clearing hostiles from the territory. The contempt in Garrett's voice was evident. I've wired the federal marshal twice about it, but seem Baldwin's got friends in high places. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, fighting the surge of memory and rage. He'd seen such auctions during his military days, prisoners of war sold into what amounted to slavery, despite laws prohibiting the practice. It was one of many injustices he'd witnessed and been powerless to stop within the system. You planning to do anything about it, Sheriff? Thomas found himself asking, surprising even himself with the question. Garrett gave him a measured look. I enforce the law, Mr. Reed. Problem is, the law's not always clear out here, and those who make it aren't always just. With that, he exited the store. Thomas knew he should pay for his supplies and ride back to his ranch. Getting involved would only risk exposure. But something pulled him toward the window, and what he saw caused his carefully constructed walls to crack. On the platform stood a young Apache woman, her chin held high despite the ropes binding her wrists. Her buckskin dress was torn at the shoulder, and her dark hair fell in tangled waves around a face that showed signs of recent bruising. But it was her eyes that seized Thomas's attention. Fierce, unbroken, blazing with a silent defiance that spoke louder than any words could. Next to her stood an elderly man, his weathered face impassive, his eyes fixed on some distant point as if refusing to acknowledge his captors. Baldwin stood beside them, a tall man with an immaculately trimmed beard and offensive clothes that set him apart from the dusty townsfolk. He gestured grandly as he spoke to the gathered crowd. These savages were caught near Porter's Ridge, where 3 good men were killed last month. Baldwin's voice carried through the open door. The Army's too busy to deal with every renegade, so it falls to us citizens to ensure justice and safety. Who'll start the bidding for this strong back? He's old, but he knows horses better than most white men. $5. Do we hear 5? Thomas felt sick. He'd heard these speeches before. The same lies used to justify the unjustifiable. His hand moved unconsciously to his gun. Mrs. Jacobson must have noticed the motion. Don't, she warned quietly. Baldwin has 6 men with him, all armed, and the marshal won't help if you start trouble. Thomas forced his hand away from his weapon. She was right. One man couldn't stop this, not with guns anyway. He'd learned that lesson at Eagle Valley at the cost of too many lives. He paid for his supplies quickly, his mind racing. As he stepped outside, the bidding for the old man had reached $8. A local rancher Thomas didn't recognize was counting out coins to one of Baldwin's men, while the elderly Apache was pulled roughly from the platform. Now, gentlemen, Baldwin continued, turning to the woman, this one's young and strong, good for housework, cooking, whatever needs you might have. The insinuation in his tone drew crude laughter from several men in the crowd. The woman's expression didn't change, but Thomas saw her shoulders tense, saw the way her eyes darted once, just once, to the mountains visible in the distance, before resuming their stony forward gaze. Let's start at $10, Baldwin suggested, and the bidding began. Thomas should have left. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to mount his horse and ride away. Instead, he found himself moving closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. Perhaps the ghost of the man he used to be, the officer who'd once believed in duty and honor before seeing how easily those concepts could be corrupted. $12, called a voice from the crowd. 15, countered another. Thomas recognized the second bidder. Hollister, one of Baldwin's foremen, a man with a reputation for cruelty. The thought of the woman falling into his hands caused something to twist painfully in Thomas's chest. $20, Thomas heard himself say, his voice carrying across the suddenly quieted crowd. Heads turned. Baldwin's eyebrows raised slightly, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Well, well, The mysterious Mr. Reed joins our civic activities. Baldwin gestured grandly. $20 from the gentleman. Do I hear 25? 25, Hollister grunted, eyeing Thomas with undisguised hostility. 30, Thomas countered immediately. The crowd murmured. This was becoming more than the usual transaction. It was becoming a contest. Baldwin was clearly enjoying the unexpected entertainment. 35, Hollister said, his voice tight with anger. Thomas met the man's gaze steadily. 40. The woman's eyes had found Thomas now, studying him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through his carefully constructed facade. There was no hope in her expression, no plea for rescue, only calculation, as if assessing which fate might be marginally less horrific. Hollister conferred briefly with Baldwin, who nodded. $50, Hollister announced loudly, a challenging smirk on his face. It was an exorbitant sum, far more than such transactions usually commanded. Thomas knew he was being baited, pushed to reveal how badly he wanted to prevent the woman from falling into Hollister's hands. Thomas had only brought $60 to town, money meant for supplies to last the winter. He had more hidden at his ranch, but not with him. If he spent $50 on the bid, he'd barely have enough for the most basic necessities. $50 going once, Baldwin called out, watching Thomas with amused interest. The woman's gaze hadn't left Thomas's face. In her eyes, he saw not just defiance, but a deep, burning intelligence. She was memorizing him, he realized. Whatever happened here, she would remember his face, his actions. $50 going twice. 60, Thomas said quietly. A hush fell over the crowd. Hollister's face darkened with rage, but Baldwin placed a restraining hand on his foreman's arm. $60, Baldwin announced, something speculative in his gaze as he regarded Thomas. A surprising price for a ranch hand who lives alone. Going once, going twice. Sold to Mr. Reed. The transaction was completed with cold efficiency. Thomas counted out his money, almost all he had brought to town, while the woman was unchained from the auction post. Her hands remained bound, and Baldwin's men shoved her roughly toward Thomas. "She's all yours, Reed," Baldwin said, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "Though I wonder what a man like you plans to do with an Apache woman. Lonely out on that ranch of yours, I suppose." Thomas ignored the insinuation, focusing instead on the woman now standing before him. Up close, he could see that beneath the dirt and bruises, she was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps in her mid-20s. Her eyes were dark, almost black, revealing nothing as they met his. "Do you have a name?" Thomas asked her quietly. She said nothing, her expression unchanged. Baldwin laughed. "She doesn't speak English, Reed, or pretends not to. We've been calling her Elena, after that mission near where we found her. Santa Elena." Thomas nodded once, then turned away, leading his horse with one hand and gesturing for the woman to follow. He could feel the stares of the townspeople, hear their whispered speculations. He had just made himself the subject of gossip and suspicion. Exactly what he'd spent 5 years avoiding. As they reached the edge of town, Sheriff Garrett stepped out from between two buildings, blocking their path. Thomas tensed, his right hand instinctively moving closer to his revolver. "That's not necessary, Mr. Reed," Garrett said calmly, noticing the motion. "I just want a word." Thomas relaxed slightly, but remained wary. "What about, Sheriff?" Garrett looked past him to the Apache woman, who stood motionless, her face impassive. "You paid a lot of money back there. More than most would. Is there a law against that?" "No law." Garrett studied Thomas's face. "Just curious about a man who spends his last dollar to buy someone's freedom, especially someone most folks around here would consider an enemy." Thomas felt a chill. The sheriff was too perceptive by half. "Who says I bought her freedom? Maybe I just need help at the ranch." "Maybe." Garrett didn't sound convinced. "Just so we're clear, I don't agree with Baldwin's auctions, but I can't stop them yet. Too many powerful men turning a blind eye." He lowered his voice. "But I also don't hold with mistreating prisoners, regardless of who they are. You understand me?" Thomas understood the warning perfectly. "She'll be treated fairly at my ranch, Sheriff. Better than she would have been with Hollister." Garrett nodded slowly. "See that she is?" He stepped aside, allowing them to pass. "And Reed, watch your back. Hollister doesn't take kindly to being outbid, especially not by a stranger who keeps to himself." Thomas acknowledged the warning with a slight nod, then continued leading his horse down the road, the woman following several paces behind. He could feel Garrett watching them until they rounded a bend and the town disappeared from view. The trail to Thomas's ranch wound through rocky terrain before descending into a small valley nestled between two ridgelines. It was isolated, defensible, the reasons he'd chosen it. The cabin itself was simple but sturdy, with a small barn and corral beside it. A creek ran nearby, providing water year-round, its surface occasionally catching the light with strange silvery reflections that had given the town its name. They traveled in silence, Thomas occasionally glancing back to ensure the woman was still following. Her steps were steady despite what must have been exhaustion and hunger. He noticed she studied the landscape intently as they traveled, her eyes marking each landmark, each potential path. Planning escape routes, he realized. It was what he would have done. As the cabin came into view, Thomas stopped and turned to her. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. In the fading light with the mountains behind her, something about her profile struck him as hauntingly familiar. "This is my ranch," he said, speaking slowly and clearly, unsure how much English she understood. "You'll have food and shelter here. No one will harm you." He gestured to her bound hands. "I'll remove those ropes, but I need your word you won't try to run. Not tonight, these hills are dangerous in the dark." Her expression remained unreadable, but she extended her bound wrists toward him in silent response. Thomas took out his knife, noting how she tensed but didn't flinch as the blade came near her skin. He cut the ropes carefully, revealing raw, chafed flesh beneath. Anger flared in him at the sight, but he kept his expression neutral. "There's salve inside for those wounds," he said, sheathing his knife. "And food." She rubbed her wrist slowly, her gaze finally meeting his directly. For a moment, something passed between them. Not trust, certainly, but perhaps the barest acknowledgement of a temporary truce. The cabin was simple, one main room with a stone fireplace, a small table with two chairs, a bed in the corner, and a variety of supplies organized neatly along the walls. A second, smaller room off to the side contained another narrow bed and a small chest for storage. "You can sleep there," Thomas said, gesturing to the smaller room. "It has a door that locks from the inside." He wanted her to understand she would have privacy, security. He lit the lamps and stoked the fire that had burned down to embers, the familiar routine giving his hands purpose, while his mind raced with the implications of what he'd done. Bringing her here had been impulsive, dangerous, exactly the kind of action he had avoided for 5 years. While water heated on the stove, Thomas prepared a simple meal: beans, dried beef reconstituted in the broth, and the last of his bread. He placed a portion on a plate and set it on the table, then stepped back, gesturing for her to eat. Elena approached cautiously, her eyes never leaving him as she sat down. She ate with deliberate slowness, though he could see the hunger in her controlled movements. She was conserving strength, he realized, storing energy. Thomas ate his own meal, standing, giving her space. When she finished, he filled a basin with warm water and placed it on the table along with a clean cloth and a small tin of salve. "For your wrists," he explained, miming the action of applying the medicine. "And there's more water if you want to wash." He retreated to the main room, giving her privacy, busying himself with arranging his meager purchases from town and mentally calculating how long they would last. With winter approaching and most of his money gone, things would be tight. He'd need to hunt more, perhaps trade labor with neighboring ranches for supplies. Later, he heard the soft closing of the bedroom door, followed by the distinct sound of the lock turning. A small, surprising relief coursed through him at the sound. She had chosen safety over escape, at least for tonight. Thomas settled into his chair by the fire, his body exhausted but his mind alert. What had he done? Brought danger to his doorstep? Certainly. Baldwin and Hollister wouldn't forget this slight, and the woman herself, she was no doubt planning her escape already, perhaps even how to kill him in his sleep if necessary. Yet beneath these practical concerns lay a deeper disquiet. Something about her seemed familiar in a way he couldn't place. Something in the proud angle of her chin, the fierce intelligence in her eyes. It had triggered memories he'd fought to suppress for 5 years, memories of flames and screams, of betrayal and failure. His hand moved unconsciously to his left shoulder, massaging the old wound that never truly healed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and carrying the first hint of winter's approach. Thomas stared into the flames, lost in thought, until exhaustion finally claimed him. He dreamed of Eagle Valley that night. He always did when the memories were stirred. In the dream, he was racing through the burning village, searching desperately for survivors amidst the chaos of gunfire and flames. His men, soldiers he had trusted, had disobeyed his direct order to hold position while he negotiated with the tribe's leader. Instead, they had attacked without warning, led by his second-in-command, Lieutenant Hayes. In reality, Thomas had managed to save only a handful of women and children, hiding them in a shallow cave before confronting Hayes. In the dream, however, he was always too late. The villagers died screaming his name, accusing him, while Hayes laughed and raised his pistol. "Traitor," Hayes would say, and then fire. Thomas jerked awake, his hand already reaching for his gun before consciousness fully returned. Dawn light filtered through the cabin windows, and for a moment he was disoriented, the dream still clinging to him like smoke. A sound from the kitchen area brought him fully alert. The woman, Elena, stood by the stove, carefully adding wood to the fire beneath the coffee pot. She had found the coffee and prepared it, and now watched him warily as he lowered his hand from his weapon. "You know how to make coffee," he observed, his voice rough from sleep. She didn't respond, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Thomas rose, wincing as his stiff muscles protested. "Thank you," he said, gesturing to the pot. As he moved to pour himself a cup, he noticed she had also found his small store of cornmeal and prepared a simple porridge. 2 bowls sat on the table. She had cooked for them both, a surprising gesture that complicated the image of her plotting immediate escape. They ate in silence, the tension in the air thick but not entirely hostile. Thomas watched her covertly, noting the careful way she observed everything around her, the cabin's layout, the location of tools and weapons. Her wrists looked better this morning. She must have used the salve he'd provided. After breakfast, Thomas knew he needed to establish some kind of understanding with her. He gestured for her to sit again at the table, then took the opposite chair, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Elena," he began, then hesitated. "Is that your name? Elena?" A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed her features, but she didn't respond. Thomas tried again. "My name is Thomas Reed," he said, tapping his chest. "Thomas." She studied him for a long moment, then finally spoke, her voice low and clear. "Not Elena." Thomas blinked in surprise, both at the words and at the perfect, unaccented English. "You speak English?" A slight bitter smile touched her lips. "Yes, I speak English, and Spanish, and Apache." Her eyes held his steadily. "My name is Amara Running Water." Thomas sat back, reassessing everything he'd assumed about her. "Baldwin said you didn't speak English." "Baldwin says many things," she replied coolly, "most of them lies." Despite the gravity of their situation, Thomas found himself fighting a smile at her dry tone. "Why pretend you couldn't understand?" Amar's expression hardened. "When enemies believe you don't understand their words, they speak freely. You learn their plans, their weaknesses." It was sound tactical thinking, the kind Thomas himself had employed during scouting missions. "Smart," he acknowledged. "So you understand why I brought you here?" "You paid $60 to keep me from Hollister," she stated, watching him carefully. "What I don't understand is why." Thomas hesitated, unsure himself of the complete answer. "Hollister is a cruel man," he said finally. "What he planned for you, no one deserves that fate." "And what do you plan for me?" Her question was direct, her gaze unflinching. "Nothing." Thomas met her eyes. "This isn't a trade or a bargain. When it's safe, when you're recovered, you are free to go." Disbelief colored her features. "Free?" "Yes." Amara's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "White men don't pay $60 for nothing." Thomas sighed. How could he explain what he didn't fully understand himself? The impulse that had driven him to intervene had been more complex than simple altruism. "Consider it atonement," he said quietly. "Atonement for what?" Thomas looked away, unwilling to delve into his past. "That doesn't matter now. What matters is you're safe here and free to leave when you choose." He paused. "Though I suggest waiting until you're stronger and until Baldwin's men stop watching the trails." Amara considered this, her expression calculating. "They're watching for me?" Probably, Baldwin doesn't strike me as a man who accepts defeat easily. She nodded slowly, some internal decision apparently reached. Then I will stay. For now. Thomas stood, relieved to have established at least this tentative understanding. Good, I have chores to tend to. You're welcome to rest or explore the cabin. Just, he hesitated. Don't go beyond the creek. The hills aren't safe right now, and not just because of Baldwin's men. Amar's expression revealed nothing, but she nodded once, accepting the boundary, for now. The day passed in a strange, cautious rhythm. Thomas tended to his horse, checked his small herd of cattle that grazed in the valley, and split firewood for the approaching winter. Occasionally, he would glance toward the cabin, half expecting to find Amara fled, but each time he saw her engaged in some task, washing clothes in the creek, gathering late autumn herbs that grew near the cabin, or simply sitting on the porch step, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains with an expression of such profound longing that Thomas had to look away. By evening, a tentative routine had formed. Thomas returned to find Amara had prepared a simple stew from the ranch's stores. They ate in silence, but it was a less tense silence than before, broken occasionally by practical exchanges about the food or the weather. After the meal, Thomas cleaned his rifle as Amara watched with undisguised interest. You know firearms, he observed, noticing the knowledge in her gaze. My father believed in knowing your enemy's weapons, she replied, before they killed him. The statement hung in the air, challenging him to respond, to place himself in the history of her people's suffering. Thomas continued his work, uncertain what to say that wouldn't sound like empty platitude. Were you a soldier? Amara asked suddenly, her eyes on the practiced way he handled the weapon. Thomas's hands stilled momentarily. What makes you ask that? You move like one. You watch the horizon, check sight lines, keep your back to walls. Your right hand never strays far from your gun. She paused. And you have nightmares about battle. I heard you last night. And Thomas felt exposed, as if she had peeled back his carefully constructed identity with a few simple observations. Yes, he admitted finally, I was a soldier, a lifetime ago. Fighting Apache? He met her gaze steadily. Yes. Amara nodded as if confirming something to herself. Yet you helped me. The army, Thomas began, then stopped, reformulating his thoughts. What I did as a soldier, the orders I followed, not all of them were right. Not all of them were honorable. So this is your atonement, she said, echoing his earlier word, saving one Apache woman to wash away the blood of many. Her assessment was too close to the truth to be comfortable. Thomas set aside his rifle, suddenly weary. It doesn't work that way. Nothing washes away blood. Amara studied him with those penetrating dark eyes. No, she agreed softly. It doesn't. The next day passed similarly, and the next. A fragile routine established itself between them. Thomas would tend to the ranch work while Amara, growing stronger daily, began contributing more. Cooking, mending clothes, even helping with the vegetable garden that supplied much of their food. They spoke little, but when they did, it was increasingly without the edge of suspicion that had marked their early exchanges. On the fourth morning, Thomas awoke to find Amara sitting at the table, her expression troubled. For her lay his spare shirt, which she had been mending. In the early dawn light, he could see what had caused her concern. Her hands were trembling violently, and a fine sheen of sweat covered her brow despite the morning chill. What's wrong? He asked him, instantly alert. Nothing yet, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. A fever. It will pass. Thomas approached cautiously, noting the unnatural brightness of her eyes. You're ill. It comes sometimes since the camps, she admitted reluctantly. It will fade in a day or two. Despite her protests, by midday Amara was confined to bed, burning with fever, her body alternating between violent chills and concerning stillness. Thomas prepared willow bark tea, one of the few remedies he knew, but her condition worsened as evening approached. In her feverish state, Amara began to speak in Apache, words Thomas didn't understand but recognized as pleas, perhaps prayers. Her hand clutched at something invisible at her throat, her distress evident even through the fever's haze. Unable to watch her suffering and feeling helpless, Thomas dampened cloths with cool water from the creek and placed them on her forehead, her wrists, the back of her neck. As he positioned a cloth on her left wrist, he noticed for the first time a distinctive scar there, a perfect handprint, as if someone with a burning hand had once gripped her arm. The sight of it stopped him cold. The room seemed to tilt around him as memory crashed through the barriers he'd built to contain it. He had seen the scar before, or rather he had seen how it was made. During the massacre at Eagle Valley, as flames consumed the Apache village, Thomas had pulled a young woman from a burning dwelling. His hand, blistered from earlier rescue attempts, had gripped her wrist as he dragged her to safety. The heat and pressure had left a mark, this mark, on her skin. "It can't be," he whispered. But even as denial formed on his lips, recognition crystallized in his mind. The proud bearing, the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the way she had studied him from the auction platform. She had recognized him, even through his beard and the scar that now marked his face. Amara Running Water had been at Eagle Valley. She had witnessed the massacre. She had seen him try and fail to stop it. And now, through some twisted joke of fate, she was here, burning with fever in his cabin, unaware that her captor and her rescuer were the same man, the failed protector of her people, Captain Caleb Thornton. Thomas sank into the chair beside her bed, his world shifting beneath him. What would she do if she knew? When the fever broke, would she see the truth in his face? And if she did, would her reaction be violence or something more complicated? As night deepened, Amara's fever worsened. She thrashed in the narrow bed, caught in nightmares Thomas could too easily imagine. Unable to leave her, he continued applying cool cloths, speaking soft reassurances she couldn't hear or understand. His left hand, the one that had gripped her wrist 5 years ago, throbbed with phantom pain, the old burn scars seeming to pulse in rhythm with her fever. Near midnight, in a moment of terrible clarity between fever dreams, Amara's eyes opened fully and fixed on Thomas's face. Recognition dawned in them, not of Thomas Reed the rancher, but of someone else. "The soldier," she whispered in English, her voice rough with fever. "The one who tried to save us." Thomas froze, unable to deny it, unable to confirm. Her gaze held his for a long, suspended moment before her eyes fluttered closed again, the fever reclaiming her. He sat in the darkness, watching her breathe, wondering what morning would bring. The truth once revealed could not be buried again. Whatever fragile trust had formed between them might shatter with the coming dawn, leaving only the harsh reality of their shared, brutal history. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the first scent of snow from the mountains. Winter was coming early, just as Mrs. Jacobson had predicted. Thomas settled deeper into his chair, preparing for a long vigil through the night. Whatever reckoning awaited them, he would face it with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through 5 years of exile. For now, all that mattered was keeping Amara alive, keeping the fever from taking her as the flames had nearly done 5 years before. This time, he would not fail. Even if saving her meant losing his carefully constructed peace, even if it meant facing the ghosts he'd fled for so long. Thomas Reed, once Captain Caleb Thornton, prepared to meet his past as the long night settled around the isolated cabin, with only the wind's whispers in a dying woman's breath to mark the passing hours. Tôi sẽ trên số lại phản thuê để đạt đối dài 60.600 từ theo yêu cầu. Tôi sẽ lược bỏ một số chi tiết không quá quan trọng cho cốt truyện chính và làm cho văn phong xúc tích hơn, nhưng vẫn giữ nguyên cốt truyện và các twist quan trọng. Dawn broke reluctantly over the valley, pale light filtering through the cabin's small windows. Thomas hadn't moved from his vigil beside Amara's bed, his body stiff from hours in the wooden chair. Throughout the night, he had continued to bathe her burning skin with cool cloths, forcing sips of water between her cracked lips whenever she surfaced briefly from delirium. As the first rays of sunlight touched her face, Amara's breathing changed, deeper, steadier. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. The feverish glaze had receded, leaving her gaze clear and focused as it settled on his face. For a long moment, neither spoke. Thomas could see recognition in her eyes, not just of him as her reluctant host, but deeper recognition. "You need to drink," he said finally, offering a cup of water. Amara accepted it, her fingers brushing his deliberately. She drank slowly, eyes never leaving his face. "You were at Eagle Valley," she said quietly when she finished. It wasn't a question. Thomas set the cup aside, fighting the urge to deny. "Yes," he admitted. "You were the officer, the one who tried to stop it." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. Yes. Captain. She paused, searching for the name. Thornton. Caleb Thornton. The name felt foreign on his tongue after so long. Amar nodded slightly. They told us you died in the fire. It was easier that way, Thomas said. For everyone. Amar's gaze dropped to her left wrist, to the handprint scar. Her fingers traced its outline, the gesture thoughtful rather than accusatory. You pulled me from the flames, she said softly. This is your hand. Thomas nodded, unable to find words. My mother died in that fire, Amar continued, her voice steady. My father was shot when he tried to surrender. My brother, she paused. I never found my brother. I couldn't stop them, Thomas said, the inadequacy of the words bitter on his tongue. I tried, but I saw, Amar interrupted. I saw you arguing with the other officer. I saw him shoot you. Her gaze moved to his left shoulder. We thought you were dead. Sometimes I think I am, Thomas admitted. Silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of shared history. Finally, Amara shifted, attempting to sit up. Thomas helped her, arranging pillows to support her back. Why did you buy me at the auction? Amara asked. Was it because you recognized me? Thomas considered the question. No, he said honestly. I didn't recognize you until I saw your scar last night. I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. Not again. Amara studied him. You said I was free to go when I chose. You are. Even knowing who I am, what I know about you? Thomas met her gaze steadily. Yes, though I'd ask you to keep my past to yourself. Thomas Reed has made a quiet life here. Caleb Thornton died at Eagle Valley, as far as the world knows. Something shifted in Amar's expression. I understand the value of a new name, she said. Names can be weapons or shields. You should rest now. We can talk more when you're stronger. But Amar's gaze had drifted to the window. Baldwin will still be looking for me, she said quietly, and not just because I escaped. What do you mean? She turned back to him, something guarded entering her expression. Baldwin believes I know the location of something valuable, something my people have kept hidden from white men for generations. What kind of something? Silver, she said simply. A place where the earth bleeds silver, deep in the mountains. My father was the last keeper of its location. Her hand moved unconsciously to her wrist. Before he died, he passed the knowledge to me. Thomas frowned. And Baldwin knows this? He suspects. There have always been rumors among your people of a great silver mine in Apache territory. Most dismissed it as legend, but Baldwin believes. She glanced toward the window. He has right to believe. The place exists. Is that why you were captured? Amar's expression darkened. No, that was simple hatred. My band was peaceful, trading with settlements. But 3 white miners were killed near Porter's Ridge, and all Apache were blamed. Her voice held bitter resignation. It's always the same story. We are all guilty for the actions of a few, while white men are judged as individuals. After they captured us, Amar continued, one of Baldwin's men recognized me from a trading post. He'd heard stories about my father being a keeper of old knowledge. Baldwin questioned me, but I revealed nothing. A flash of pride crossed her features. So he decided to sell me instead. He didn't know I understood every word they spoke. He plans to track whoever bought me, thinking I might lead him to the silver if I escaped. And would you? Try to reach this place? It is sacred to my people. More than just silver, it is where our ancestors' spirits dwell. I am its keeper now. Thomas considered what she'd told him. The creek here, he said slowly, the way it sometimes catches the light shows silver reflections. It comes from higher in the mountains. Surprise flickered across Amar's face. You've noticed. Is that why you've stayed? Because the sacred place is near? Partly, she admitted. Though I'm not yet sure exactly where, the landmarks my father described. Some have changed, and I'm still too weak to search properly. She hesitated. But I've stayed for another reason too. What reason? To understand why the soldier who tried to save my people is hiding as a rancher. To decide if Thomas Reed can be trusted with Caleb Thornton's shame. The assessment was blunt, but fair. Thomas nodded slowly. And have you decided? Not yet. Amar's expression softened slightly. But I'm still here. That says something, doesn't it? Before Thomas could respond, a sound outside caught his attention, the distant but unmistakable rhythm of approaching horses. He rose quickly, moving to the window. "Someone's coming," he said, reaching for his rifle. "At least 3 riders." Amara stood, the blanket falling from her shoulders as she moved to his side. "Baldwin's men?" "Possibly." Thomas checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded. "Or it could be neighbors, though no one comes calling after dark without good reason." He handed Amara his revolver, the gesture automatic. She took it without hesitation, checking the chambers with practiced efficiency. "Go to the back room," Thomas instructed. "If it's trouble—" "I won't hide," Amara interrupted firmly, despite her weakened state. "Not again." Thomas wanted to argue but recognized the steel in her tone. He nodded once, then moved to douse most of the lamps, leaving only one burning low near the door. 3 men, Thomas confirmed, watching through the window, moving cautiously, not trying to surround the cabin yet, but spreading out as they approach. "Not friendly visitors, then," Amara observed quietly. The riders stopped about 30 yards from the cabin. After a moment, one figure dismounted and approached alone. "Hello, the house," called a familiar voice. "It's Sheriff Garrett. I'm coming in peaceful." Thomas felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Come ahead, Sheriff," Thomas called back. "Alone." He opened the door as Garrett approached, keeping his rifle visible but lowered. The sheriff stepped into the light, his badge catching the lamplight. His expression was grave as he took in Thomas and Amara. "Evening, Reed," Garrett said. "Ma'am." He nodded to Amara, his gaze lingering briefly on the weapon in her hand. "What brings you out here at this hour, Sheriff?" Thomas asked. "Information I thought you should have sooner rather than later." Garrett removed his hat. "Baldwin's been making noise in town about you, claims you stole something valuable of his." "The woman he was selling illegally at auction?" Thomas's voice was flat. "That and something else. He's telling anyone who'll listen that she knows the location of a lost silver mine. Says she's the daughter of an Apache chief who guarded its secret." Garrett's gaze shifted to Amara. "Says he's offering $100 to whoever helps recover his property, both the woman and the information she has." Thomas felt Amara tense beside him, but kept his own expression neutral. "And you rode out here in the dark to tell me this because—" "Because Hollister and 4 men left town armed to the teeth about 2 hours ago, and they weren't heading for Sunday services." Garrett's expression was grim. "I'm here unofficially, Reed. Can't arrest a man for riding out of town, even if I know damn well what he's planning." "And your companions outside?" "Deputy Wilkins and Martha from the boarding house. She insisted on coming when she heard where I was headed. Says she has information for the lady." Thomas exchanged a look with Amara, who gave a slight nod. "Bring them in," he decided. Deputy Wilkins entered first, a young man with a nervous demeanor but earnest eyes. He nodded respectfully to Thomas and Amara, taking a position near the door. Martha Wilkins followed, a tall, dignified woman in her 60s with silver hair, pulled back in a severe bun, and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She assessed the cabin and its occupants in a single sweep before focusing on Amara. "So you're the one causing all this fuss," she said, her tone direct but not unkind. "I was at that shameful auction. Couldn't stomach watching, but I heard what happened." Her gaze shifted to Thomas. $60 is a lot of money for a man who keeps to himself." Martha turned back to Amara. "You speak English? Understand it at least?" "I speak it fluently," Amara replied, a hint of challenge in her voice. Martha's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded in approval. "Good, makes things simpler. Baldwin's been telling everyone you know where to find a legendary silver mine. That true?" Amara hesitated, looking to Thomas, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I am the keeper of sacred knowledge," Amara said carefully. "What Baldwin seeks would destroy a place holy to my people." Martha studied her, then nodded as if satisfied. "My son was a newspaper man," she said. "Before he died, he was investigating military actions against peaceful tribes. Had a theory that someone high up was orchestrating attacks on Apache lands that happened to have valuable minerals." She reached into her coat and withdrew a small leather journal. "Found this among his things after. Never made sense to me, but I think it might to you." She held the journal out to Amara, who took it cautiously. "Why are you giving this to me?" Amara asked. Because my boy died trying to expose a truth nobody wanted to hear, Martha said simply. And because I've lived long enough to know that greed makes monsters of men, regardless of what god they claim to worship or what color their skin is. Amara opened the journal, scanning the first page. Her expression changed as she read, a mixture of surprise and grim confirmation. Sheriff, Thomas said, how much time do we have? Garrett frowned. Hollister had a 2-hour head start, but they'll be moving careful in the dark. I'd guess they'll be here by dawn, positioning themselves around the valley while it's still dark. Classic ambush strategy, Thomas murmured. They'll wait for first light when we're visible, but they're still in shadow. You could come back to town with us, Deputy Wilkins suggested. Thomas shook his head. Baldwin has too much influence in town, and this is my home. I won't be run off it. Besides, Amar added quietly, what we need to protect isn't here. It's up in the mountains. Martha's sharp gaze fixed on her. The silver place? Your sacred ground? Amara nodded. If Baldwin finds it, he will destroy it, not just for the silver, but because it matters to my people. Garrett spoke after a moment of silence. I can't officially intervene in what might be called a private dispute, he said carefully. Baldwin has too many friends in high places, but I can delay Hollister, maybe redirect him if you need time. Thomas glanced at Amara, a silent question passing between them. She gave a small nod. We need to reach the sacred site before Baldwin's men, Thomas said. If we leave now, in the dark, we might have a chance. The silver creek that runs through this valley comes from the sacred place, Amara explained. I realized it yesterday. Thomas chose this ranch without knowing what lay upstream. If we follow the creek up into the mountains, Thomas continued, Amara can recognize the landmarks her father described. It's dangerous territory, Garrett warned. Steep, unfamiliar, easy to get lost or trapped, especially in the dark. I know these mountains, Amara said confidently. My people lived in them for generations before being driven out. The darkness won't hinder me. They quickly gathered supplies, food, water, ammunition, and blankets for the cold mountain nights. As they prepared to leave, Amara approached Thomas, the journal clutched in her hand, her expression troubled. The journal, she said quietly. It mentions Eagle Valley and a Colonel Theodore Hayes. Thomas felt a chill run through him at the name. Hayes was a lieutenant when I knew him, he said carefully. My second in command. He's the one who shot me when I tried to stop the massacre. According to this, Amar said, tapping the journal, he's been promoted rapidly since then, and he's been involved in a series of incidents with Apache bands who happened to be living on valuable land. The implications were sickening. Thomas had believed Eagle Valley to be an aberration, a terrible moment when discipline broke down. There's more, Amar continued, her voice dropping further. Martha's son was investigating a connection between Hayes and a mining consortium. One of the principal investors is listed here. She opened the journal to a marked page. Wesley Baldwin. Thomas took the journal, reading the entry with growing dread. According to Martha's son's investigation, Baldwin had been financing Hayes's operations for years, using military action to clear native tribes from land with mineral wealth, then acquiring the land through government connections once it was pacified. If this is true, Thomas said slowly, then what happened at Eagle Valley wasn't just a breakdown in discipline. It was deliberate, planned. Yes, Amara agreed grimly, and Baldwin isn't just after me or the silver. He's eliminating witnesses to his arrangement with Hayes. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Thomas handed the journal back to Amara, his decision solidifying. We need to find your sacred place, he said, not just to protect it, but to understand what Baldwin and Hayes have been doing. There may be evidence there that connects them. Amara nodded, carefully tucking the journal into her clothing. We should go, now. They said brief goodbyes to Garrett, Wilkins, and Martha, who would return to town by a different route to throw off any followers. Thomas led his horse from the barn, while Amara gathered the last of their supplies. As they prepared to depart, Martha approached Amara one last time, pressing something into her hand. Take this, the older woman said. My son carried it for protection. Didn't save him, but maybe it'll serve you better. Amara opened her palm to reveal a small Derringer pistol. Your son, she said softly. He died trying to expose the truth about Hayes and Baldwin. Martha's expression was a mixture of grief and determination. They made it look like an Apache attack. Convenient, that. But my boy never would have ridden into hostile territory without making contact first. He respected your people. She straightened her shoulders. Find what he was looking for. Make it matter that he died. Amara tucked the derringer into her clothing and clasped Martha's hand briefly. I will, she promised. His truth will be told, Martha said, glancing toward the fading ghost of her son. Yes, Amara agreed, placing a gentle hand on Martha's shoulder. All their truths will be told. As the marshals led a defeated Hayes toward the passage, one of them paused, cocking his head as if listening. Someone's coming, he warned, drawing his weapon. Sheriff Garrett moved toward the entrance, hand on his revolver. More of Hollister's men? Not likely, the marshal replied. Sounds like a single rider, moving fast. Thomas positioned himself protectively near Amara, his own weapon ready. They'd come too far to be surprised now. One of the marshals guarding Hayes suddenly stiffened. Hayes is smiling, sir, he reported, a note of unease in his voice. Indeed, despite his wounded shoulder and the manacles on his wrists, Hayes wore an expression of grim satisfaction. You didn't think I came alone, did you? He said quietly. Baldwin's too careful for that, always has a contingency plan. As if summoned by the words, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. A new figure entered the cavern, a tall, imposing man in an expensive suit, his beard neatly trimmed, his eyes cold and calculating, despite the wonder that briefly crossed his face at the cavern's splendor. Wesley Baldwin, Sheriff Garrett said grimly, you've saved us the trouble of finding you. Baldwin surveyed the scene with practiced composure, though his jaw tightened at the sight of Hayes in custody. I received word my foreman hadn't returned, he said smoothly. Naturally, I came to investigate. These mountains can be treacherous for the unprepared. Thomas mounted his horse, then helped Amara up behind him. She was still weak from her fever, but her determination was evident in the straight line of her spine as she settled behind him. The creek will guide us, she said, pointing to where the water glinted silver in the moonlight. My father said to follow it to where it divides 3 ways beneath the stone that looks like an eagle's head. Thomas nodded, turning the horse toward the trail that led upstream into the mountains that loomed dark and imposing against the star-filled sky. The trail grew steeper as they ascended, following the silver creek that sometimes disappeared underground only to emerge again further up the slope. Thomas let Amara guide him, trusting her knowledge of the land even in darkness. She sat close behind him, her body warm against his back, her directions coming as quiet murmurs near his ear. As the night deepened around them, Thomas found himself thinking of the man he had been 5 years ago. Captain Caleb Thornton had believed in duty and honor, had trusted the system he served. The disillusionment that followed Eagle Valley had driven him into hiding, into a life of isolation where he could avoid confronting the failures of that system. But now, riding into the mountains with Amara, he felt something stirring that he had thought long dead. Purpose, clarity, the certainty that came with taking a stand rather than retreating. You're thinking loudly, Amara observed after a particularly long silence. Thomas smiled slightly. Just wondering how I ended up here, riding into the mountains in the middle of the night with a woman who has every reason to hate me. Hate is a luxury, Amara replied thoughtfully. It requires energy I cannot spare. She paused. Besides, I saw you try to stop it. I saw Hayes shoot you for trying. That counts for something. Not enough, Thomas said quietly. No, she agreed. Not enough to erase what happened, but enough to make me willing to ride with you now. Her tone shifted. We should rest soon. The horse needs it, and we'll need our strength for what's ahead. They stopped in a small clearing sheltered by overhanging rocks. As the flames cast dancing shadows, Amara spoke again. Tell me about Hayes, she said. What kind of man is he? Thomas poked at the fire, considering his answer. When I knew him, he was ambitious, calculating, good at following orders from above, harsh with those below. He paused. We were at West Point together. He was always precise, everything by the book, but with a coldness to it. Like the rules mattered more than the people they were meant to protect. And you were different? Thomas stared into the flames, searching for honesty. I tried to be, he said finally, but I was part of the same system. I followed orders, even when those orders meant displacement and suffering. He looked up, meeting her gaze across the fire. I told myself I was doing my duty, that it wasn't my place to question the larger strategy, until Eagle Valley. What changed that day? Thomas's hand moved unconsciously to his left shoulder. I saw Hayes's face when he gave the order to attack. There was pleasure there, or satisfaction. And I knew then that what was happening wasn't about security or peace or any of the justifications we'd been given. It was about something else entirely. Power, Amar suggested. Greed. Yes, Thomas nodded slowly, though I didn't understand the full scope until now, until Martha's son's journal connected Hayes to Baldwin and the mining interest. Amara wrapped her blanket tighter. My father suspected something similar. He told me that the attacks on our people had changed, become more targeted, focused on specific places. He said the White Army no longer wanted just our submission. They wanted our sacred lands, the places where the Earth's treasure lies. The silver, Thomas murmured. Not just silver, Amara corrected. Gold, copper, other metals your people value. Many are found in places our ancestors considered holy. Her expression grew distant. My father believed we were not just fighting for our freedom, but for the soul of the land itself. You should sleep, he said softly. I'll keep watch until dawn. This time, Amara didn't protest. She settled deeper into her blankets, her eyes drifting closed. Wake me if anything changes, she murmured. I will. As Amara's breathing deepened in sleep, Thomas maintained his vigil, rifle across his knees, ears attuned to the night sounds of the mountain. The Silver Creek murmured nearby, its voice a constant companion in the darkness. He thought about the journey ahead, not just the physical path up the mountain, but the larger journey he had begun when he decided to bid for Amara at the auction. Each step had led inexorably to this moment, as if fate had been guiding him toward a reckoning he had tried to avoid for 5 years. Dawn broke over the mountains in streaks of pale gold and rose. A thin layer of frost coated the ground around their small camp, evidence of the dropping temperature. Thomas, who had maintained his vigil through the night, felt the stiffness in his joints and the familiar ache in his old wound. Amara woke fully at once, without the gradual transition most people experience, a trait Thomas recognized from his own military days, the habit of those accustomed to danger. You didn't wake me for my watch, she observed, gathering her blankets around her. You needed the rest, Thomas replied simply. How's your fever? Amara touched her forehead briefly. Gone for now. She rose carefully. We should eat quickly and continue. Baldwin's men will be moving by now. They shared a sparse breakfast of jerky and hard biscuits, washing it down with water from the creek. As they ate, Amara studied the surrounding terrain. We're close, she said finally. Perhaps half a day's journey, if we can continue to follow the creek. But the way becomes more difficult from here, steeper, with fewer trails. They mounted up and resumed their journey upward. As they rode, Amara pointed out features in the landscape, explaining their significance in Apache tradition. A certain arrangement of rocks marked a boundary between hunting territories. A twisted tree indicated a place where healing herbs could be found. A particular pattern of coloration on a cliff face told the story of an ancient battle. Your people read the land like a book, Thomas observed. We are part of it, and it is part of us, Amara replied. When white men look at the mountain, they see obstacles to overcome or resources to extract. We see ancestors, stories, the fabric of our existence. By midday, they reached a point where the path narrowed dramatically, becoming little more than a ledge along a steep cliff face. We'll need to continue on foot from here, Amara said. The horse can't safely manage this trail. They secured the horse in a small, grassy area with access to water, taking only what they could carry: food, water, ammunition, and a few essential supplies. By mid-afternoon, they had climbed high enough to see for miles. Thomas paused, looking back the way they had come. The valley where his ranch lay was visible in the distance, a patch of green amid the rugged landscape. Look there, he said, pointing to movement on a trail below them. Riders, at least 4, maybe 5. Amara followed his gaze, her expression grim. Baldwin's men, they found our trail. They're still hours behind us, Thomas reassured her, and they'll have to leave their horses at the same point we did. Yes, but they're fresh. We're tired, and I'm not at full strength. Amara's assessment was pragmatic. We need to reach the sacred site before nightfall. They pushed on with renewed urgency. The creek narrowed as they climbed higher, becoming a swift, shallow stream that sparkled with increasing brilliance in the afternoon light. The silver quality that had given it its name was more pronounced here, closer to its source. There, Amara said suddenly, pointing ahead to where a massive rock formation jutted from the mountainside. Its shape resembled a bird of prey's head, the beak formed by a protruding spur of darker stone. The eagle's head, the creek divides beneath it. Sure enough, as they approached, the Silver Creek split into three smaller streams, each flowing from a different direction before joining at this point. Amara stood still for a moment, her eyes closed, lips moving silently as if reciting something memorized long ago. When she opened her eyes again, they were bright with certainty. "We follow the middle stream," she said, pointing to where the water emerged from between two massive boulders. "It leads to the heart of the sacred place." The path became even more difficult, sometimes requiring them to climb rather than walk. Thomas's shoulder protested each strain, but he pushed through the pain, keeping pace with Amara, who moved with the determination of someone approaching a long-sought destination. The sun was low in the sky when they reached what appeared to be a dead end, a sheer cliff face with the stream emerging from a narrow opening at its base, too small for a person to enter. Amara studied the cliff carefully, her gaze moving methodically across its surface. Finally, she approached a section that appeared no different from the rest to Thomas's eyes. She ran her hands over the rock, pressing in specific places, murmuring words in Apache. To Thomas's astonishment, a portion of the cliff face shifted slightly, revealing it to be a cunningly disguised door of sorts, made of stone but balanced so perfectly that even a woman in Amara's weakened state could move it with properly applied pressure. Beyond the opening lay a narrow passage, just wide enough for a person to walk through sideways. From within came the sound of rushing water and a soft, silvery light unlike anything Thomas had seen before. "The sacred place," Amara said softly, reverence clear in her voice. "Few outsiders have ever seen it. Are you ready?" Thomas nodded, understanding the significance of what she was offering. Trust, acceptance, a chance at redemption. "Lead the way," he said quietly. Amara stepped through the opening, and after a moment's hesitation, Thomas followed, leaving behind the fading daylight for the mysterious glow that beckoned from within the mountain's heart. The passage widened after several yards, opening into a vast cavern that took Thomas's breath away. The ceiling soared overhead, pierced in places by narrow shafts that allowed beams of late afternoon sunlight to penetrate the darkness. But it wasn't the natural architecture that made the place extraordinary. It was the silver. Veins of pure silver ran through the rock walls like frozen lightning, catching and reflecting the light in ways that seemed almost alive. The stream they had followed flowed across the cavern floor, its bed lined with silver deposits that caused the water itself to shimmer and dance. At the center, a natural pool had formed where several small waterfalls converged, the surface so still and reflective it appeared to be liquid silver rather than water. "It's incredible," Thomas whispered. Amara moved forward, her steps reverent, her hand trailing along the cavern wall. "This is the heart of our creation stories," she said softly, "where the first Apache emerged from the earth, where our ancestors return when life ends. The silver is their bones, their memories, preserved in stone." Thomas followed her deeper into the cavern, understanding now why Baldwin coveted this place so desperately. The silver deposits visible on the surface alone represented a fortune. If mined conventionally, the sacred site would be destroyed, reduced to a hole in the ground surrounded by tailings. "My father was the guardian," Amar continued, approaching the central pool, "as his father was before him, and all the way back to the beginning. When he died, the responsibility passed to me." She knelt by the pool, dipping her fingers into the silvery water. "I am the last. There is no one to follow me." The sorrow in her voice echoed in the cavern, a grief not just for her lost family, but for a way of life that was vanishing. "What happens now?" Thomas asked quietly. Amara remained kneeling by the pool, her reflection shimmering in its surface. "Now we wait," she said simply. "Baldwin's men are coming. We will meet them here at the heart of what they seek to destroy." "Just the two of us? Against at least 4 armed men?" Thomas frowned, military training asserting itself. We're at a tactical disadvantage, Amara. We should find a defensive position or— No, Amara interrupted, rising to face him. This is not about tactics or strategy. This is about truth and consequence. She gestured around the cavern. This place has power, Thomas. Not just the silver that men like Baldwin covet, but true power. The kind that changes hearts, reveals truths. Thomas wanted to argue, to insist on a practical approach to the danger, but something in Amara's certainty gave him pause. What would you have us do? He asked instead. Prepare a fire, she said, pointing to a circular stone arrangement near the central pool. And then I will show you what my father taught me, the true purpose of the guardian. As Thomas gathered wood from a small stockpile near the cavern wall, Amara moved around the sacred space, touching specific points on the walls, murmuring words he couldn't understand. There was purpose in her movements, a ritual quality that spoke of generations of tradition. By the time he had the fire ready, the last direct rays of sunlight had faded from the shafts above, leaving the cavern illuminated primarily by the ethereal glow of the silver veins. They will be here soon, she said, kneeling beside the fire. From a small pouch at her waist, she withdrew a handful of herbs, which she cast into the flames. Immediately the fire changed color, burning with a blue-white intensity that reminded Thomas of the silver itself. Now we complete the preparation. Before Thomas could question her further, a sound from the passage entrance caught their attention. Voices, footsteps, the unmistakable signs of their pursuers arriving. It begins, Amara whispered, rising to her feet and moving to stand beside the silver pool, her posture straight and proud despite her lingering weakness. Stand with me, Thomas Reed. Stand with the truth. Thomas took his place beside her, his hand resting on his revolver but making no move to draw it. Whatever came next, he sensed it would not be resolved by gunfire alone. The first figure emerged from the passage, Hollister, Baldwin's foreman, his expression shifting from triumph to awe as he beheld the silver cavern. Behind him came three more men, all armed, their faces illuminated by the strange glow of the sacred place. And then, emerging last, came a figure Thomas had not expected. Taller than the others, wearing the uniform of a colonel in the United States Army, his face older but unmistakable. Theodore Hayes had arrived at the heart of the mountain, and with him, the ghosts of Eagle Valley that Thomas had fled for 5 years. The moment of reckoning had come. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended in the silver-lit cavern. Thomas stared at the face he'd hoped never to see again. Theodore Hayes, now adorned with the insignia of a full colonel, his features harder than Thomas remembered, but unmistakable. The man who had ordered the massacre at Eagle Valley. The man who had shot Thomas when he tried to stop it. Hayes froze mid-step when he saw Thomas, disbelief washing over his features before hardening into cold calculation. In that moment, Thomas was transported back to their days at West Point. Hayes always at the top of the class, brilliant but rigid. A man who saw the world in absolutes, while Thomas had always questioned, always sought the nuances that Hayes dismissed as weakness. Well, Hayes said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber, Captain Thornton, reports of your death seem to have been exaggerated. Thomas stood his ground, suddenly aware that his hand had moved to his revolver without conscious thought. It's just Thomas Reed now, he replied evenly. The captain died at Eagle Valley. A flash of something, perhaps genuine confusion, crossed Hayes's face. You always were prone to dramatics, Thornton, even at the point. Remember that night before graduation? You questioning our orders to relocate those Cherokee families? His mouth twisted into a smirk. Always the bleeding heart. The casual reference to their shared past struck Thomas like a physical blow. There had been a time when he'd considered Hayes a friend, a brother in arms, before ambition and cruelty had consumed whatever humanity the man once possessed. And you were always willing to follow any order that advanced your career, Thomas countered, memories flooding back. No matter who it hurt. Hayes's gaze shifted to Amara, narrowed in recognition. With one of the savages we were sent to pacify. How fitting. He tilted his head slightly. Though this one looks familiar. From Eagle Valley, perhaps. Thomas felt Amara tense beside him, but sensed her restraint. She was waiting, watching, letting the scene unfold in this sacred place that seemed to amplify every word, every emotion. Hollister looked between Hayes and Thomas, confusion evident in his rough features. "Colonel, you know this man?" "We served together," Hayes said, not taking his eyes off Thomas, "until he decided his sympathies lay with the enemy." "I decided my sympathies lay with innocent people being slaughtered," Thomas corrected, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning within him. "With honor over blind obedience, with truth over convenient lies." Hayes laughed, the sound harsh and incongruous in the shimmering cavern. "Always the idealist, Thornton. Even at West Point, you never could accept the necessities of progress." He gestured around the silver-veined chamber. "And now look where your idealism has led you. Cornered in a cave with an Apache woman and nowhere to run." One of Hollister's men whistled low, his eyes roaming the silver deposits visible throughout the cavern. "Jesus, Hollister, look at all this. Baldwin was right." "Oh, shut up," Hollister growled, but his own gaze betrayed similar greed as it tracked the veins of precious metal running through the stone walls. "The silver ain't worth dying for," another of Hollister's men muttered, eyeing Thomas's ready stance and Amara's unwavering composure with growing unease. "I didn't sign up for no shootout with a former Army captain." "Nobody's dying if they follow orders," Hollister snapped, but Thomas noticed the uncertainty in his voice, the way his eyes darted between Hayes, his nervous men, and the vast riches embedded in the cavern walls. Hayes seemed less interested in the silver than in the confrontation at hand. He took a step forward, and Thomas noticed that despite his confident demeanor, the colonel kept his right hand near the service revolver at his hip. "I'm curious, Thornton," Hayes said. "What exactly was your plan here? Surely you didn't think you could hide forever, or perhaps—" His gaze slid to Amar again, contempt evident. "You found a different kind of life among the savages?" "The only savage I see here is you, Hayes," Thomas replied, feeling a long-suppressed anger finally breaking through the surface. "You who ordered the slaughter of women and children. You who shot a fellow officer in the back for trying to stop a massacre." "I shot a traitor," Hayes snapped, his composure cracking momentarily. "A man who forgot his duty to his country and his race." Thomas felt, rather than saw, Amara shift slightly beside him. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to resonate with the very walls of the cavern. "Your duty?" she asked, addressing Hayes directly. "Was it your duty to attack peaceful villages? To drive people from lands they had lived on for generations?" Her eyes bore into Hayes. "Or was your duty to men like Baldwin, who paid you to clear land for their silver mines?" Hayes's expression flickered with surprise, then narrowed with suspicion. "You know nothing, woman." "I know everything," Amara countered. From within her clothing, she withdrew Martha's son's journal and held it up. "Your arrangements with mining interests, the coordinated attacks on Apache bands living near valuable minerals, the bribes to territorial officials to look the other way." For the first time, Hayes appeared genuinely unsettled. His gaze fixed on the journal, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Where did you get that?" he demanded. "From the mother of the man you murdered for discovering your secret," Thomas said. "Martha Wilkins's son, the journalist you had killed and blamed on an Apache attack." Hayes's face hardened. "Unfortunate, but necessary. The boy was poking his nose where it didn't belong. Just as you are now, Thornton." "Necessary?" Amar's voice took on a new edge. "Like it was necessary to kill my father when he offered peace? When he extended his hand to you at Eagle Valley?" She stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance. "I am Amara Running Water, daughter of Chief Gray Wolf of the Eagle Valley Band. You shot him yourself, Colonel Hayes, after he laid down his weapons." Hayes's eyes widened slightly at this revelation, his gaze reassessing Amara with new wariness. "The chief's daughter," he murmured. "We thought all his family died in the fire." "Not all, Amara said. "I survived to witness against you, to ensure the truth would not die with my people." Hollister shifted impatiently, his attention divided between the tense confrontation and the riches surrounding them. "Colonel, we should secure the woman and the mine. Baldwin's waiting for word." "Baldwin," Thomas repeated, pieces falling into place. "He finances your operations, doesn't he? Tells you which villages to target, which land to pacify for settlement, and in return, you ensure he gets first claim on any valuable resources discovered." "It's called progress, Thornton," Hayes said, his voice regaining its confident edge. This territory needs men of vision, men willing to do what's necessary to bring civilization to the wilderness. He gestured dismissively toward Amara. These people had their time. That time is past. Thomas felt his anger rising but forced himself to remain calm. And Eagle Valley? Was that progress too? Or was it just another land grab disguised as military action? Something dark flickered across Hayes's features. Eagle Valley was regrettable in its execution, but necessary. The Apache there were sitting on one of the richest silver deposits we'd found. They refused to relocate peacefully. They were farmers, Amara said, her voice tight with controlled fury. They traded with settlements. They posed no threat to anyone. My father was negotiating a formal peace agreement with the territorial governor when you attacked. They were obstacles, Hayes countered coldly. Like all your kind. Obstacles to the inevitable march of civilization. The tension in the cavern thickened. Thomas could feel Hollister and his men growing restless, eager for action rather than this unexpected confrontation. One of Hollister's men, the youngest, barely more than a boy with sandy hair peeking out beneath his hat, took a step back, his face troubled. "This ain't right, Hollister," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Attacking peaceful folks for their land. That ain't what I signed on for." His hand dropped away from his gun belt. Hollister turned on him, eyes flashing with anger. "Shut your mouth, Parker," he growled. "You'll do as you're told if you want to see your pay." Parker glanced at Amara, then back to Hollister, conflict evident in his young face. "Money ain't worth a man's soul," he said, quietly, taking another step back. "Coward," Hollister spat, but his attention quickly returned to the more immediate threat of Thomas and Amara. One of Hollister's men, the youngest, barely more than a boy, took a step back, his face troubled. "This ain't right, Hollister," he muttered. "Attacking peaceful folks for their land? That ain't what I signed on for." "Shut your mouth, Parker," Hollister growled. "You'll do as you're told if you want to see your pay." The tension in the cavern thickened. Thomas could feel Hollister and his men growing restless, eager for action rather than this unexpected confrontation. The silver gleaming in the rock around them seemed to pulse with the rising emotions, catching and reflecting the blue-white light from the fire Amara had prepared. "Enough talk," Hollister finally growled, raising his rifle. "You're outnumbered, Reed, or Thornton, whatever your name is. The woman comes with us. This place belongs to Mr. Baldwin now." Thomas's hand tightened on his revolver, but Amara placed a restraining touch on his arm. "This place belongs to no man," she said, her voice carrying a strange, resonant quality that seemed to fill the cavern. "It is the dwelling place of spirits, the heart of the mountain, the memory of my people." Hayes snorted derisively. "Superstitious nonsense. This is a silver deposit, nothing more." Amara smiled then, a knowing expression that somehow made Thomas's skin prickle with anticipation. "Is it?" she asked softly. She turned toward the central pool, raising her hands in a gesture both reverent and commanding. "Then let the mountain itself judge between us." Before anyone could react, Amara began to speak in Apache, her voice building in intensity. The words flowed like water over stone, ancient and powerful, echoing through the cavern in rhythmic patterns that seemed to resonate with the silver veins themselves. Thomas didn't understand the language, but he recognized a prayer when he heard one, a calling to powers beyond human understanding. Amara cast something from her pouch into the central pool. Herbs, perhaps, or some mineral Thomas couldn't identify. The surface of the water shimmered, then began to glow with increasing brightness, illuminating the entire cavern with silvery light. As her chant continued, the light took on a blue tinge, pulsing in rhythm with her words. "What trick is this?" Hayes demanded, his hand now firmly on his revolver. "Witch!" one of Hollister's men exclaimed, crossing himself hurriedly. "She's calling devils!" Amara ignored them, continuing her invocation. The light from the pool intensified, and to Thomas's astonishment, the silver veins in the walls began to pulse in rhythm with her words, as if the very rock were responding to her call. The air in the cavern grew thick with an energy Thomas couldn't name but could feel pressing against his skin, raising the hair on his arms. "Shoot her," Hollister ordered, raising his own rifle. Thomas drew his revolver in one fluid motion, pointing it at Hollister. "Try it, and you die first," he warned. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Hollister's men with weapons half raised. Hayes's hand on his service revolver. Thomas prepared to fire if any of them made a move toward Amara. And through it all, Amara continued her ritual, her voice rising and falling like water over stone, the silver light growing ever brighter. Then something extraordinary happened. The light from the pool began to coalesce, forming shapes above the water's surface. Ghostly, shimmering figures that gradually took more defined form. Thomas stared in disbelief as the figures became recognizable. Apache men, women, and children, their forms translucent but unmistakable. "Mother of God," whispered Parker, the young man who had questioned Hollister earlier. His rifle slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering on the cavern floor. Thomas recognized some of the spectral figures, faces he had seen briefly at Eagle Valley before the massacre, people he had tried and failed to save. An old woman with dignity in her bearing despite her ghostly form, a young boy holding a wooden toy, and most distinct of all, a tall man with feathers in his hair and the unmistakable presence of leadership, Chief Grey Wolf, Amara's father. This spectral figure separated from the others, approaching Hayes with purposeful strides. Though ghostly, its features were clear enough for recognition, and Hayes staggered back, his face drained of color. What is this?" he stammered, his composure shattered. "The truth," Amara said simply. "The mountain remembers what happened at Eagle Valley. It remembers all the blood spilled for silver and gold. The spirits of those who died bear witness against you." Hollister and his men were backing away now, terror evident in their expressions as more spectral figures emerged from the pool. Two of the men turned and fled toward the passage entrance, abandoning their weapons in their haste to escape. Parker remained frozen in place, his young face a mixture of awe and terror. "They ain't out here to hurt us," he whispered more to himself than anyone else. "They just want to be seen, to be remembered." "Damn you all, they're just tricks," Hayes shouted, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. He drew his revolver, aiming it wildly at the approaching spectral forms. "Stay back!" Thomas kept his weapon trained on Hayes, unwilling to trust the man even in his current state of panic. "It's over, Hayes," he said firmly. "The truth is exposed. Whatever happens here tonight, Martha Wilkins has copies of her son's journal. Your arrangement with Baldwin will be revealed." Hayes's eyes darted frantically between Thomas, Amara, and the ghostly figures that continued to emerge from the pool. Something seemed to break within him, the careful facade of military discipline crumbling to reveal the fear beneath. "You don't understand," he said, his voice suddenly plaintive. "Baldwin isn't just some businessman. He has connections all the way to Washington. Senators, cabinet members. They all have investments in these territories. If this comes out, then they'll fall with you," Thomas finished grimly. The spectral form of Chief Grey Wolf now stood directly before Hayes, its ghostly eyes filled with a terrible knowledge and judgment. The colonel's hand shook visibly, his revolver wavering as he faced this impossible confrontation with his past. Hollister, seeing his remaining men abandoning the fight, made a desperate decision. "To hell with this," he shouted, raising his rifle not at the spirits but at Amara. "Stop the witch, and this all ends." Thomas reacted instantly, diving toward Amara to push her out of the line of fire just as Hollister's shot rang out. They tumbled to the ground together, but not before Thomas felt the searing pain of a bullet grazing his side. In the chaos that followed, Hayes saw his opportunity. He lunged forward, grabbing the journal that had fallen from Amara's hand during Thomas's protective tackle. "This ends now," he snarled, turning his revolver toward the central pool where the spirits continued to emerge. But as Hayes moved to destroy the evidence, Martha Wilkins stepped forward with surprising speed for her age. She placed herself directly in front of Hayes, her weathered face set with determination. "You've taken enough, Colonel," she said, her voice steady despite the danger. "You took my son. You took these people's homes and lives. You won't take their truth, too." Hayes faltered momentarily, shocked by the elderly woman's boldness. "Get out of my way, old woman," he snarled, raising his weapon, "or you'll join your meddling son." "Then so be it," Martha replied, her eyes flashing with defiance as she reached for the journal. "My James died for this truth. I'm not afraid to do the same." Her unexpected courage created the distraction Thomas desperately needed. As Hayes's attention was divided between Martha and the journal, Thomas managed to get back to his feet, ignoring the pain in his side, ready to intervene before Hayes could harm the brave woman. Before anyone could stop him, Hayes fired 3 rapid shots into the sacred waters. The effect was immediate and devastating. The pool's surface erupted in a fountain of silver light, sending shockwaves through the cavern. The ghostly figures wavered, their forms distorting, and an unearthly wail filled the chamber. Not a sound of pain so much as profound grief and outrage. Thomas struggled to his feet, clutching his bleeding side, as the cavern itself seemed to respond to the desecration. The ground trembled beneath them, and small fragments of rock began to fall from the ceiling. "What have you done?" Amara cried, her face pale with horror. Hayes stood at the edge of the disturbed pool, a mad triumph in his eyes as he held the journal over the churning waters. "Your evidence dies here," he declared, "along with your spirits and your superstitions." But as he moved to drop the journal into the pool, a new figure materialized from the silver mist. Not an Apache spirit this time, but a young white man in work clothes, a notebook clutched in spectral hands. Though Thomas had never seen him alive, he immediately knew who this was. Martha Wilkins' son, the journalist who had died pursuing the truth about Hayes and Baldwin. Hayes recoiled, his face contorting with fresh terror. "Impossible," he whispered. The ghost of the young journalist reached out, not toward Hayes, but toward the journal in his hand. At the same moment, a new voice rang out from the passage entrance. "Theodore Hayes, drop your weapon immediately." Thomas turned to see a group of men entering the cavern, Sheriff Garrett in the lead, followed by several figures in formal attire who could only be the federal marshals Martha had mentioned. Behind them came Martha Wilkins herself, her silver hair gleaming in the unearthly light, her expression a mixture of shock at the spectral display and grim satisfaction at finding Hayes. Hayes, caught between the advancing lawmen and the accusing spirits, made one last desperate move. He lunged toward Amara, grabbing her roughly and pressing his revolver to her head. "Stay back," he shouted, "or the Indian woman dies." Thomas raised his revolver, but the angle was poor, and he dared not risk a shot with Amara in danger. The federal marshals likewise hesitated, unwilling to provoke Hayes further. It was Martha who broke the impasse. She stepped forward, her eyes fixed not on Hayes but on the spectral form of her son hovering near the pool. "James," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "My boy." The ghost seemed to respond to her voice, turning toward her with the expression of profound love and peace that transcended death itself. Then, with deliberate purpose, the spectral journalist turned back toward Hayes and Amara. In that moment of distraction, Amara acted. She drove her elbow hard into Hayes's midsection, simultaneously ducking her head. As Hayes doubled over, gasping, Thomas saw his opening and fired, not to kill, but to disable. His bullet struck Hayes' shoulder, the same place Hayes had shot him 5 years before. Poetic justice. Hayes crumpled to the ground, dropping both Amara and the journal. The federal marshals surged forward, securing the wounded colonel before he could recover. "It's over, Hayes," said the lead marshal, a stern-faced man with silver at his temples. "We have your correspondence with Baldwin. We have financial records, and now we have you." As the marshals read Hayes his rights and bound his wounds, Thomas rushed to Amara's side, his own injury forgotten in his concern for her. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently. She shook her head, her eyes on the pool where the spirits were beginning to fade, their purpose fulfilled. "The sacred waters are disturbed," she said quietly. "It will take time for balance to be restored." The cavern's trembling had subsided, but the damage to the pool remained. Its silvery surface now rippled and clouded, where Hayes's bullets had desecrated it. The few remaining spectral figures hovered near the water, their forms growing fainter by the moment. Martha Wilkins approached them, her eyes red but her bearing dignified. She bent slowly to retrieve her son's journal from where it had fallen near Hayes. "He can rest now," she said, glancing toward the fading ghost of her son. "His truth will be told." "Yes," Amara agreed, placing a gentle hand on Martha's shoulder. "All their truths will be told." As the marshals led a defeated Hayes toward the passage, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. A new figure entered the cavern, a tall, imposing man in an expensive suit, his beard neatly trimmed, his eyes cold and calculating, despite the wonder that briefly crossed his face at the cavern's splendor. "Wesley Baldwin," Sheriff Garrett said grimly. You've saved us the trouble of finding you. Baldwin's confident expression faltered as he took in the scene. Hayes in custody, federal marshals present, and the journal containing evidence of their conspiracy in Martha's hands. But ever the businessman, he quickly composed himself. "Sheriff, there seems to be some misunderstanding," he began smoothly. "I merely came to investigate reports of trespassers on land I've filed mining claims for." "The only misunderstanding," said the lead marshal, "is your belief that you're beyond the reach of federal law, Mr. Baldwin." He nodded to one of his men, who stepped forward with manacles. "Wesley Baldwin, you are under arrest for conspiracy, corruption of military personnel, and accessory to multiple acts of violence against peaceful settlements." Baldwin's mask of civility cracked, raw fury showing through. His gaze found Thomas and Amara, hatred burning in his eyes. "You," he snarled, "this is your doing, isn't it? You and that Apache witch." "No," Thomas replied calmly. "This is your doing, Baldwin. Yours and Hayes. Your greed. Your cruelty. The truth was always going to find you eventually." Baldwin's laugh was harsh, echoing against the silver-veined walls of the cavern. "Truth? You know nothing about the truth, Thornton." Thomas stiffened at the use of his real name. Baldwin smiled coldly, seeing the reaction. "Oh yes, I know exactly who you are. Hayes told me all about the noble Captain Thornton who tried to interfere at Eagle Valley." Baldwin's eyes narrowed at Thomas. "Eagle Valley wasn't Hayes's decision alone. I had mining claims staked there months before the incident. I needed that land cleared, and Hayes needed advancement. A mutually beneficial arrangement." The confession hung in the air, stunning even the federal marshals. Baldwin seemed beyond caring, his facade of respectability finally crumbling completely. "5 other sites before Eagle Valley," he continued, almost boastful now. "All rich with silver, all conveniently pacified by military action after I discovered their potential. We had a system, Hayes and I, perfectly legal if one knew how to frame the paperwork." "You ordered the deaths of hundreds of innocent people for silver," Amara said, her voice tight with controlled fury. Baldwin regarded her with contempt. "Progress demands sacrifice. Your people were simply unfortunate obstacles." Martha Wilkins stepped forward, her lined face rigid with anger. "My son discovered your system, and you had him murdered for it." "Regrettable," Baldwin shrugged, "but necessary. Business is business, after all." "No," Thomas replied calmly. "This is your doing, Baldwin. Yours and Hayes's. Your greed, your cruelty. The truth was always going to find you eventually." As Baldwin was taken into custody alongside Hayes, Thomas felt a strange lightness come over him, as if a burden he had carried for 5 long years had finally been lifted. Justice, so long delayed, had finally arrived. The marshals efficiently secured their prisoners, gathering the evidence Martha provided and taking preliminary statements from those present. Thomas noticed one official in particular, a serious man with spectacles who identified himself as being from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, paying special attention to the cavern itself and to Amara's explanations of its significance. "Ms. Runningwater," the man said respectfully, "with your permission, I'd like to document this site for protective designation. Recent directives from Washington have emphasized the importance of preserving indigenous sacred locations." Amara looked surprised at the respectful address but nodded slowly. "That would be welcome," she said, "but the documentation must be done with proper reverence. Some aspects of this place are not meant for government records." "Of course," the official agreed. "You would guide the process. Your knowledge would be essential." As arrangements were made for transporting the prisoners and securing the site temporarily, Thomas found himself standing at the edge of the central pool with Amara. The spectral figures had all faded now, returning to whatever realm they had emerged from, but the silver light continued to pulse gently from the depths of the water, though dimmer than before. "Will it heal?" Thomas asked quietly, gesturing to the disturbed pool. Amara nodded. "In time. The mountain has endured much. It will endure this too." She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the silver light. "As we have endured." The wound in Thomas's side had begun to throb painfully, the adrenaline of the confrontation wearing off. Amara noticed his discomfort and immediately turned her attention to the injury, examining it with practiced hands. "It's not deep," she assessed, "but it needs cleaning." She tore a strip from her own clothing, dipped it in the clear water that flowed into the pool from one of the small falls, and began to gently clean the wound. Thomas watched her work, struck by the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. From an auction block in Silver Creek to a sacred cave in the mountains. From strangers bound by circumstance to, what? Allies? Friends? Something more complex that had no easy name? What happens now? He asked softly. Amara's hands paused briefly in their ministrations. Now we go forward, she said simply. The past has been faced. Justice has begun its work. What remains is to build something new from what has been preserved. Sheriff Garrett approached them, his expression weary but satisfied. Marshal Sanders wants to speak with you both before we head down the mountain, he said. But it can wait until you're patched up, Reed. Thomas, he corrected, the decision crystallizing in that moment. Thomas Reed is who I am now. Thornton was another life. Garrett nodded in understanding. Thomas, then. He glanced around the cavern, shaking his head in wonder. Never seen anything like this. Never believed I would either. His gaze returned to them, serious now. Whatever happens with the legal proceedings, Baldwin has powerful friends. You two might want to watch your backs for a while. We will, Thomas assured him. Thank you, Sheriff, for everything. As Garrett moved away to confer with the marshals, Amara finished binding Thomas's wound. Her touch lingered slightly longer than necessary, a wordless acknowledgement of all they had shared. Ready to face the world below? She asked. Thomas nodded, finding strength despite his fatigue and pain. Ready. The journey down from the sacred cave was slow and careful. Hayes and Baldwin were secured on horses, under heavy guard by the federal marshals. Martha Wilkins rode beside Sheriff Garrett, occasionally casting backward glances at the mountain, as if bidding farewell to her son's spirit. Thomas and Amara followed, sharing a single mount, his arms around her waist, both for stability and comfort. By the time they reached the valley where Thomas's ranch lay, the sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The silver creek that ran through his property seemed to catch and hold the light, a reminder of its connection to the sacred source high above. The federal party would continue to town with their prisoners, but Thomas and Amara, along with Martha and Garrett, stopped at the ranch. Deputy Wilkins had kept the cabin secure in their absence and had a fire going, the simple comfort of warmth and shelter a welcome respite after the day's extraordinary events. As night fell, Martha and Garrett took their leave, promising to return the next day with news of the proceedings against Hayes and Baldwin. The marshals had requested formal statements from both Thomas and Amara, but had granted them a night's rest before that ordeal. Alone at last, Thomas and Amara sat before the fire in companionable silence. The events in the cave seemed almost dreamlike now, viewed from the mundane comfort of the cabin, yet the reality of what they had witnessed and what it meant for their futures remained undeniable. I keep thinking about those spirits, Thomas said finally. Your people and Martha's son. Do you believe they're at peace now? Amara considered the question, her face thoughtful in the firelight. My people believe that spirits remain restless when injustice goes unanswered, she said. Today, they must say they were heard, their truth was witnessed. That brings a measure of peace. She paused, her gaze distant. But true peace will only come when the living honor what was learned through their sacrifice. And how do we do that, Thomas asked? By remembering, by protecting what they valued, by building something better in the world they left behind. She turned to look at him directly. The Indian Affairs official spoke of a new policy, protecting sacred sites, acknowledging the rights of Native peoples to their heritage. If he was sincere, it's a start, Thomas acknowledged. Small, perhaps, compared to what's been lost, but a beginning. Amara nodded. Beginnings matter. She reached out, her fingers lightly tracing the bandage visible at the edge of his shirt. You were willing to die today. For me. For the truth. So were you, Thomas pointed out. You faced Hayes knowing what he was capable of. A small smile touched her lips. Perhaps we are both a little foolish. Or perhaps we both finally found something worth the risk, Thomas replied, capturing her hand gently in his. The firelight played across their joined hands, his larger, weathered by years of ranch work, hers smaller but equally strong, marked with the handprint scar that had first revealed his identity to her. Different in so many ways, yet similarly shaped by loss, by struggle, by the search for a place to belong. The official offered me a position, Amara said after a moment, to help document and protect other sacred sites, to speak for my people where decisions are made about our lands. Thomas felt a sharp pang at the thought of her leaving, but nodded. That sounds like important work. Work you'd do well. It would mean traveling, she continued, throughout the territory, perhaps beyond. She paused, her dark eyes holding his. But it would also mean having a home to return to, a place of safety and rest between journeys. Hope flickered to life in Thomas's chest. This valley has good water, he said carefully. The land is fertile, and the Silver Creek connects it to the sacred place. A guardian should live near what they protect, Amara agreed, the barest hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. You would be welcome here, Thomas said, his voice low with emotion. More than welcome. Amara's fingers tightened around his. Even though I brought danger to your door, revealed your past, led you into a confrontation with the man who tried to kill you? Because of all that, Idisha, Thomas clarified. Because for the first time since Eagle Valley, I stood and faced the truth instead of running from it. Because of you, I remembered who I was meant to be. And who is that? Amara asked softly. Thomas Reed or Caleb Thornton? Neither, he said. Or perhaps both. A man who failed once but found the courage to stand again. A man who's been given a second chance to do what's right. Amara nodded, understanding in her expression. My people have a belief, she said, that when two souls have traveled difficult paths separately, only to find those paths converging against all odds, it is not coincidence but design. The spirits guide such journeys. And our paths? Thomas asked. Where do they lead from here? Instead of answering with words, Amara reached out, her hand finding his. Her fingers were warm despite the evening chill, strong despite her recent ordeals. Thomas curled his fingers around hers, the simple contact more profound than any embrace could have been. Forward, Amara said finally, answering his question. Our paths lead forward, together. Thomas felt the rightness of her words settle into his bones. Whatever challenges lay ahead, federal investigations, Baldwin's remaining allies, the complex work of protecting the sacred site, they would face them united by a bond forged in fire and silver light. 3 months later, Thomas stood on the porch of his ranch house, their ranch house now, watching the late winter sun sparkle off the silver creek that wound through the valley. The land was beginning to wake from its winter slumber, hints of green showing where snow had recently blanketed the ground. Much had changed in those 3 months. Hayes and Baldwin had faced preliminary hearings in the territorial court. Their case eventually referred to federal authorities due to the scope of their crimes. The evidence compiled by Martha's son, combined with testimony from Thomas, Amara, and several others who had come forward once the conspiracy was exposed, had proven damning. The sacred cave had been officially designated a protected site under a new federal policy, with Amara named as its primary guardian and cultural interpreter. Her role with the Indian Affairs Bureau had expanded beyond what was initially offered, as officials recognized the value of her knowledge and her unique position bridging two worlds. Thomas adjusted his position slightly, the old wound in his shoulder aching in the crisp air. Some pains would always remain, reminders of the past that could not be erased. But they were balanced now by new joys, new purpose, new connections that gave meaning to what had once been mere survival. The sound of hoofbeats drew his attention to the trail leading to the ranch. Amara was returning from her latest journey, a 2-week expedition with government surveyors to document other sites of significance to the Apache people. Though he had missed her deeply, Thomas understood the importance of her work and took pride in supporting it. She rode into view, her posture straight and confident in the saddle, her dark hair catching the afternoon light. Behind her came 2 other riders, a young Apache man Thomas recognized as one of Amara's distant cousins, who had joined her work as an apprentice guardian, and surprisingly, young Parker, the former member of Hollister's gang who had questioned his employer's actions in the sacred cave. After the confrontation, Parker had sought Amara out, asking to make amends for his unwitting role in Baldwin's schemes. She had seen something worthwhile in the boy, offering him a chance at redemption as a liaison between the territorial authorities and the Apache community. Thomas had been skeptical at first, but Parker had proven earnest in his desire to help protect what he had once been hired to plunder. Thomas stepped off the porch to greet them as they dismounted. Amara came to him first, her smile warming him more effectively than any fire could have. "The northern sites are secure," she reported, though her eyes conveyed much more than her words. "The Bureau has assigned permanent rangers to patrol them." "Good news," Thomas replied, returning her smile. "Martha sent word while you were gone. The federal prosecutor has added new charges against Baldwin based on evidence found in his offices. He won't see freedom for many years, if ever." Satisfaction flickered across Amara's features. Justice, while imperfect and slow, was being served. After seeing to the horses and sharing a meal with their guests, Thomas and Amara found themselves alone on the porch as evening settled over the valley. The first stars had appeared in the darkening sky, the same stars their ancestors had looked upon for countless generations, his from across the ocean, hers from this very land. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, breaking a comfortable silence, "about building an addition to the house, a proper study for your records and maps, maybe a larger kitchen." Amara glanced at him, a question in her eyes. "If you're agreeable," he continued, suddenly nervous despite the months of growing closeness between them, "I thought we might make this arrangement more permanent." Understanding dawned in Amara's expression, followed by a warmth that answered his unspoken question better than words could have. "The guardian traditionally passes their knowledge to the next generation," she said softly. "I had thought that tradition would end with me, but perhaps—" Thomas reached for her hand, his heart full. "Perhaps some traditions find new ways to continue," he suggested. Amara nodded, turning to face the valley that had become their shared home. "This land has known much pain," she observed, "but it has endured, as we have endured. And now it can heal," Thomas said, "as we are healing." In the distance, the Silver Creek caught the moonlight, a shimmering thread connecting their small ranch to the sacred cave high in the mountains. The spirits of Eagle Valley had found their voice at last, their truth revealed after years of silence. Justice, long delayed, had finally begun its slow but inevitable course. And in a valley touched by silver waters, two souls from different worlds had found in each other what neither could have found alone. Not just healing for the wounds of the past, but the courage to forge a new path, one that honored both where they had come from and where they might go together in the days to come. The story of the Promised Land was just beginning. The following spring, as wildflowers bloomed across the valley, Thomas and Amara stood together by the Silver Creek. It wasn't a traditional white wedding, nor was it a purely Apache ceremony. Instead, it was something uniquely theirs, a blend of both worlds, much like the life they had created together. Martha Wilkins had helped arrange a small gathering, with both settlers from Silver Creek and members of Amara's extended Apache family in attendance. Sheriff Garrett stood proudly as Thomas's witness, while Amara's young cousin represented her family. Amara wore a dress of soft buckskin adorned with silver beads that caught the sunlight, a crown of local wildflowers in her dark hair. Thomas had never seen anything more beautiful. At her suggestion, they exchanged simple silver bands crafted from a small piece of ore from the sacred cave, properly blessed and given with the mountain's permission, Amara had assured him. Two rivers joining to form one stronger current, the elderly Apache spiritual leader said as he blessed their union in his native tongue, Martha translating for the settlers present. Two paths becoming one road forward. As Thomas looked into Amara's eyes, he realized how far they had both traveled to reach this moment. Across deserts of pain and mountains of fear, through valleys of loss and plains of uncertainty. Yet here they stood, not at an ending but at a new beginning. The ceremony by the creek marked more than just their union. For many in Silver Creek, it was the first time they had broken bread with Apache people as equals rather than enemies. Thomas watched with quiet pride as Martha Wilkins engaged in animated conversation with an elderly Apache woman about medicinal plants. Nearby, young Parker was learning a traditional Apache game from Amara's cousins, laughter bridging what had once been an insurmountable divide. Even more surprising was the presence of several federal officials who had traveled specifically for the occasion. The Indian Affairs representative who had helped designate the sacred cave as protected land raised his glass in a toast. "To a new chapter in this territory's history," he announced, where wisdom prevails over prejudice and preservation over plunder. It wasn't perfect harmony. Generations of mistrust couldn't be erased in a single day, but it was a beginning, a small model of what might be possible on a larger scale. Thomas caught Amara's eye across the gathering and saw his own hope reflected there. A month after their ceremony, Thomas and Amara traveled to the territorial capital for the dedication of the James Wilkins Memorial Library. Martha stood proud but tearful as the governor unveiled a plaque honoring her son's sacrifice in pursuit of truth and justice. His work changed things, she told them afterward, as they shared a quiet moment on a park bench. The territorial legislature has established a commission to investigate other cases like Baldwin and Hayes. They're calling it the Wilkins Commission. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her dress. James would have been pleased, I think. Amara covered Martha's hand with her own. He sees. The spirits always see when justice is done in their name. Martha had become a regular visitor at their ranch, her initial wariness of Amara's heritage long forgotten. In many ways, she had become the bridge between Silver Creek and the growing number of Apache people returning to their ancestral lands under new federal protections. The news from Washington arrived on a crisp autumn morning. Thomas unfolded the official letter as Amara looked over his shoulder, her breath catching as she read. "The president has signed it," Thomas said, barely believing the words himself. "The Native Sacred Sites Protection Act." It was just a beginning, a small legal recognition that some places held value beyond the minerals they might contain. But it was more than either of them had dared hope for a year ago. The act specifically cited the Silver Creek Cave as its inspiration, acknowledging Amara's testimony before Congress as instrumental in its passage. Reports from the territorial courts were equally encouraging. Baldwin's conviction had triggered investigations into similar operations throughout the West. 3 more military officers had been court-martialed, and a senator had resigned in disgrace after his investments in Baldwin's enterprises were exposed. "Systems don't change overnight," Sheriff Garrett had said during his last visit, "but they do change when good people refuse to look away." Standing on their porch that evening, watching the Silver Creek catch the last light of day, Thomas realized that their small valley had become something he never expected. Not just a hiding place, but a beacon. Not just a home, but a beginning. "We've started something, haven't we?" he asked Amara softly. She nodded, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "The story is larger than just us now," she agreed, "as all good stories should be." In the distance, the mountain that held the sacred cave stood silhouetted against the fading sky, a silent guardian of memory and possibility, of past wounds and future healing. The promised land wasn't just a place, Thomas realized, but a journey, one they would continue together, step by step, day by day, for all the days to come.